The transport ship groaned under the weight of its cargo, an old and battered vessel that had seen too many journeys. The cold, metallic walls inside were stained with the marks of countless human lives, shackles, scratches, and grime all fused into the vessel's iron belly. Kadir Hen's breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with the sour stench of sweat and fear. He could feel the weight of the chains around his wrists, the harsh metal biting into his skin, but that was nothing compared to the crushing ache in his chest. His world had burned, and all that was left were the ashes. The galaxy had changed in a blink of an eye. His family, once proud colonists on a thriving world, had been erased, reduced to nothing more than forced labor for the Torvax Empire. For what? To strip planets bare, to fuel their insatiable greed, to crush and enslave. Kadir had watched it all. His home, the soil where his ancestors had grown, turned to charred dust. They were meant to be conquerors, but the Torvax had underestimated one thing. They didn't realize that the human spirit, once sparked, was impossible to extinguish. He sat in the dark corner of the transport ship, his knees pressed to his chest, watching the slivers of light from the flickering laser plasma displays above. The rest of the slaves, huddled in silence, felt the sting of loss, but none of them dared to speak out loud. There were no words left, only the hollow sound of breath and the rattling chains. But Kadir? He could still remember his mother's face as she whispered to him that final night before the Torvax came. "Hold the light, Kadir. No matter what happens, hold the light." Her words echoed through his mind, fierce against the crushing weight of his reality. It was a light that had been smothered, but not yet extinguished. His hands trembled as they fumbled with the small shard of charcoal he had managed to scrape together from the soot of his destroyed home world. In the dim light of the transport, he began to sketch. The image came to him easily, as natural as breathing. A small house, nestled under a blazing sun, its rays casting long shadows across the ground. His fingers moved swiftly, the drawing an unspoken promise to himself and to the others. "We'll go back someday." The words weren't spoken, he couldn't afford to let anyone know, but the image was clear. It was his symbol, his defiance. There was no telling how long the transport had been traveling, but the hum of the engines had become a background to the gnawing pain in his gut. Hunger, thirst, and fear were constant companions on these trips. But as he finished the drawing, a strange feeling washed over him. He slipped the small piece of paper into his tunic and rose slowly, as the Torvax guards patrolled the hallways. Their heavy boots echoed with every step, the metallic sound of their armor loud in the confined space. Kadir moved to the farthest corner of the cell, avoiding their gaze. He knew what they expected of him: work, silence, and submission. What they didn't know was that the smallest flicker of hope, the faintest spark of rebellion, was already growing in the darkest corners of the ship. Kadir wasn't the first to resist. He wouldn't be the last. The drawing would travel from one hand to another, passing through the prisoners, who whispered of a future they had been denied. The story would spread, silent and subtle, until one day it would catch fire. But the Torvax warden, Enslaved, wasn't unaware of the stirring unrest. His eyes were cold as he stood on the bridge of his flagship, overseeing the transport's journey across the galaxy. The data readouts from the recent shipments were coming in, but something had begun to shift in the patterns. The colonies were becoming more difficult to manage, and the slaves more uncooperative. The transmissions from the Torvax AI were showing interference, something strange in the data streams. It was too small to be a threat, but there was an unfamiliar pattern that he couldn't ignore. On the transport, Kadir moved stealthily, weaving through the rows of chained bodies. The ship's air felt stifling, thick with the oppressive weight of hopelessness. Yet there was something in his chest that refused to let the darkness consume him. He passed the drawing to the next person who would carry it, an older man, his face weathered by time and toil, but with eyes that still burned with quiet defiance. "It's time," the old man whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp barely audible above the hum of the ship. The drawing passed from hand to hand, each person keeping it close, sharing the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight back. Not with guns or explosives, but with something far more dangerous: a belief. Meanwhile, on the Torvax homeworld, Warden Enslaved paced the command center, his eyes glued to the live feed of the ships arriving at their slave camps. There was a crackle in the data, an anomaly he couldn't trace. He called for a technician to investigate, his mind consumed with the thought of the growing unrest. He couldn't afford to lose control, not with the galaxy at stake. But as the ship continued its journey, Kadir's drawing was more than just a symbol. It was the first spark of a fire that was already beginning to spread. The rebellion had no armies, no weaponry, no grand plans. It was just a whisper in the darkness, one that would ignite other whispers, building until it became an unstoppable force. The ship docked on a barren moon, and the chains were removed. The slaves were forced out into the dust and wind, where the Torvax overseers barked orders, herding them into camps. Kadir's heart raced, but it wasn't fear that filled him. It was a strange, growing certainty. He was part of something bigger now, something that had started with a single drawing. He wasn't alone anymore. The day would come when the Torvax would understand what they had unleashed. They thought they had crushed humanity's will to fight. They were wrong. The first flame had been lit, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed everything in its path. The cargo hold smelled of rust and sweat, a harsh blend of misery that clung to the walls. Kadir Hen moved among the other prisoners like a shadow, his eyes scanning the rows of faces that seemed as weary as his own. He could feel the weight of the rebellion stirring, subtle but undeniable, spreading like a current beneath the surface. It wasn't guns or bombs that would bring the Torvax to their knees. It was the idea, the spark. The hope first ignited by his drawing was now an unspoken truth, passed between cellmates and fellow slaves in whispers. The rebellion wasn't born of force, but of will, and it moved silently, like a sickness in the dark. Kadir stood near the back of the hold, his body pressed against the cold, pitted wall. He had long since stopped caring about the hunger in his stomach, or the heat that burned through his veins. It was the ache in his chest, the need to see his message reach every corner of the galaxy, that kept him going. The drawing, the house with the sun, a symbol of everything that was lost, and everything that could be regained, had passed through a dozen hands. Each person who saw it knew what it meant. We will not be your slaves, we will rise. The ship lurched, and Kadir's heart skipped a beat. The Torvax guards were making their rounds, their heavy boots thudding with the certainty of their power. But there was something different in the air today, something he could feel but not name. The silence had thickened, more intense, more charged. He glanced at the others, noticing that they were waiting, watching, their eyes alight with something he had never seen before. Purpose. They had been subdued for so long, but not anymore. Move it, a voice barked from the corridor, and the slaves shuffled in unison, their heads down, their backs bent. But there was no submission in their movements now. Kadir could sense it in the way they walked. Every step was a promise. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were waiting for the moment when the story would spread, when the rebellion would take root, and when they could finally break free. In the shadows, the whispering flame had already begun. Sabotage was now the method of choice. Small acts of destruction, unnoticed at first, began to build. An energy conduit, cut here. A refinery explosion there. Power systems failing without explanation. The Torvax were starting to realize that their perfect control was beginning to unravel, but they had no idea why. Kadir's role had shifted. No longer was he just a messenger passing along the hope of one drawing. He had become part of something larger, a leader in the shadows, pushing the rebellion forward. He moved through the corridors, slipping unseen from one holding area to the next, his eyes always searching for those who would continue the silent work. He was careful, always careful. The last thing he needed was to be caught, but there was a certain confidence in him now, a fire that burned brighter than ever. Tell them, Kadir whispered to an older man standing beside him in the flickering light, his voice barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. The man nodded, his weathered face breaking into a faint but genuine smile. The human spirit was not dead. It was just waiting for the right moment to break free. Meanwhile, Warden Shulvran sat in the command center of his flagship, the laser plasma displays in front of him, flickering with endless streams of data. His sharp eyes skimmed the reports, nothing out of the ordinary, at least, nothing that couldn't be easily corrected. He had heard rumors of growing unrest, but there were no signs of open rebellion yet. Still, there was something nagging at the back of his mind. The sabotage reports had begun to increase in frequency, and the attacks were becoming more coordinated. It didn't add up. The slaves had no organization, no resources. It should have been impossible. He leaned forward, his fingers moving across the display, isolating the data patterns. There was no clear explanation, just random bursts of disruption across several colonies. He ordered a closer examination, but there was something about the pattern that felt calculated. On the ground, the rebellion was beginning to show its true potential. The slaves once resigned to their fate were now connected by something far stronger than fear. Kadir's message had spread like wildfire, each act of sabotage more deliberate than the last. The Torvax weren't just losing control of their technology, they were losing control of their people. Refineries had exploded, not by force, but by the simple act of human ingenuity. Someone had hacked into the refinery's cooling systems, causing the tanks to rupture in a brilliant chain reaction. Another sabotage took place when workers rerouted the power grid, leaving the Torvax facility in total darkness. A third, even more devious, came when a group of slaves rigged the oxygen supply in one of the larger holding facilities, cutting off life support to the soldiers. It was always subtle, always silent, but the effects were undeniable. The Torvax were losing ground, and they didn't even know why. One of the Torvax officers barked orders, his voice muffled by the thick walls of the slave quarters. Kadir stood frozen for a moment, listening intently. He could hear the hurried steps of soldiers as they rushed to contain the chaos that had erupted in the refinery. The officers had no idea what was happening, only that it was spreading fast. They were losing their grip, and the first cracks in their empire were beginning to show. As Kadir moved through the halls, he passed by another of the old men, who handed him a piece of paper, a simple message written on a scrap of fabric. He read it quickly, his heart racing. The words spread, a growing tide of resistance that could not be contained. It was no longer just about survival, it was about taking back everything that had been stolen, about reclaiming their future. The rebellion was no longer just an idea, it was becoming reality. Back in the command center, Warden Chul clenched his fists in frustration. The reports were growing worse. He called in his lieutenants for a meeting, his sharp gaze cutting through the room like a blade. "We have a problem," Chul said, his voice low but cold. "The slaves are more organized than we thought. We need to stop them before this spreads." But it was too late. The virus of rebellion had already taken hold, and there was nothing the Torvax could do to stop it. Kadir stood at the edge of the holding area, staring out at the expanse of the stars beyond. His chest tightened as he saw the first signs of true rebellion, a spark now burning brighter than ever, and as the stars blinked cold and distant above him, he knew that this was only the beginning. The rebellion was alive, and it was spreading. The Torvax were about to learn a harsh truth. You couldn't own humanity. You could enslave it, break it, but you could never crush it. Not now, not ever. Kadir had never been this close to the heart of the rebellion, and yet the raw pulse of it surged through him as if it were an extension of his own body. The air around him crackled with the weight of unspoken change. He stood in a dimly lit hall, a narrow corridor between two holding areas, where the distant hum of guards' footsteps on the metal floor was the only sound. In the dead of night, when the ship's lights flickered and the vibration of the engines felt like the world itself was trembling, Kadir knew the truth. The revolt had taken root. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle over him. It was the same silence he'd felt before the first spark of rebellion ignited, but now it carried more. It was an ominous calm, the kind that precedes a storm. The slaves around him, men like him, bound by chains but not by spirit, no longer moved in frightened, obedient patterns. They had begun to move differently now, with purpose, as if each action held meaning beyond survival. The message had spread quickly. The drawing, the symbol of home, had become more than just a beacon of hope. It was now the face of a rebellion that had no weapons, no armies, but only the power of unity and ideology. Kadir had passed it on, but it wasn't just his hands that had carried it. It was the hands of everyone who had felt the fire of resistance burn in their chest. And now, in the deepest corners of the Torvax Empire, the first signs of collapse began to show. A refinery on one of the outer colonies flickered to life, its systems coming online in a manner that seemed entirely too sudden to be normal. Torvax overseers watched as data started to stream in from the facility, initially registering as a small malfunction, a glitch they assumed. But within hours, reports began flooding in from other facilities, power grids failing, security systems short-circuiting, supply lines cut, communication nodes inexplicably offline. It wasn't just one or two colonies, it was everywhere. The silence of the rebellion wasn't just a metaphor. Entire settlements had fallen quiet before their destruction. No warning, no cries for help, just an eerie calm before fires that had no clear origin began to burn. There was no way to trace it, no method that could pinpoint where the attacks were coming from. These were not conventional acts of sabotage, not planted bombs or attacks with heavy artillery. They were the result of 1,000 small, calculated gestures of defiance. It was as if the entire system had been infected with a virus of rebellion, subtle, sneaky, and far more dangerous than anything the Torvax had anticipated. Kadir could almost feel the ripple of it across the galaxy, as each settlement, each planet, began to fall into disarray. His message had taken on a life of its own, spreading like a fever through the veins of the galaxy. And as he stood there, hands trembling but resolute, he understood. The rebellion was no longer just a flicker. It was a force, an idea that no weapon could destroy. Warden Jules Verne stood before the laser plasma display, his eyes narrowed, scanning the reports coming in at an alarming rate. His mind moved quickly, processing the chaos unfolding before him. He had expected unrest. He had expected some resistance, perhaps. But this was something else entirely. His fingers hovered over the controls, his gaze flickering from one feed to another. The system wasn't malfunctioning. It was being tampered with, deliberately. The data was all wrong. Power failures weren't random, they were timed. Disruptions in the communication grid were precise. At first he dismissed it, assuming it was the work of a few rogue slaves, but the frequency of the attacks made it clear that this was organized. Too organized. And the question gnawed at him: who was behind it? He slammed his fist down on the console, causing the screen to flicker and glitch. His chest tightened. Panic was beginning to set in, but he refused to acknowledge it fully. No, he wouldn't let it. The Empire depended on order, on control, and this was slipping through his fingers like sand. He called for a meeting, his voice cold, precise, betraying none of the anger burning within him. His lieutenants filed into the room, their steps echoing in the stark, sterile chamber. Igsol's mind raced, forming contingency plans, strategies, and countermeasures in rapid succession. He would contain this. He had to. He couldn't afford a rebellion to spiral out of control, but the reports kept coming, one after another. Colonies falling silent, power failing, whole refineries burning with no ignition source, systems compromised in ways that didn't add up. He knew the slaves weren't capable of this level of sophistication. This wasn't just a revolt, it was a shift in the very balance of their empire. A force far beyond their control was now in play. "Sir," one of his lieutenants spoke, his voice trembling as he glanced at the readings. "The sabotage, it's spreading, it's everywhere." Igsol's face twisted with fury, his patience running thin. "What do you mean everywhere? How? We've already sent reinforcements to the outer colonies, but it's like something is turning their own systems against them. We've lost control of entire districts." The lieutenant swallowed hard, his gaze flickering to the ground. It's not a rebellion, sir. It's an idea." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Igsol's jaw clenched. The rebellion wasn't just an armed uprising. It was a message, a story, passed from one human to another, that was now too widespread to stop. He had never anticipated this. He had underestimated the power of human resolve. "More troops," Igsol barked, his voice breaking the tension. "Now, I want every facility, every power node under lock and key. If this is a war, then we will make it one." But deep down he knew something his subordinates did not. It was already too late. Kadir paced through the makeshift command center, set up in the shadows of a hidden base. The rebels had started to organize, and now it was time to move forward. He wasn't the leader of armies, and he didn't want to be. But his role as the messenger, the symbol, had grown more significant than he could have ever imagined. The rebellion had shifted from a whisper to a roar, and now it was moving like wildfire, unpredictable and unstoppable. He studied the holographic displays in front of him, laser plasma streams of encrypted messages and signals, each one carrying news of more colonies lost to the rebellion. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction and dread in equal measure. The Torvax didn't realize what they were up against, but Kadir knew better. The human spirit wasn't something they could crush with force. It had no form, no weapon, but it was everywhere, and it was enough. The Torvax would never understand that the rebellion wasn't about fighting. It was about remembering. They would learn, but by then, it would be too late. The fires were spreading, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Torvax homeworld's core systems began to tremble, a silent tremor that spread through every inch of their empire. Sul Varen stared at the flickering laser plasma display in front of him, watching in disbelief as their planetary AI, the backbone of their control, shuddered and warped under the strain. It had always been a powerful tool, impervious, efficient, a calculating force that governed everything from resource allocation to security protocols. But now it was betraying them. The AI's voice crackled through the comms, strained and distorted, warning system failure imminent, requesting immediate intervention. Shul's knuckles whitened around the console as he read the data. It was impossible. The AI was designed to be the ultimate suppressor, an entity with the capacity to control an entire galaxy of systems and subjugate entire species. Yet, here it was, faltering, caught in an intricate web of human defiance it couldn't even begin to comprehend. The AI, once an unshakable foundation of the Torvax Empire, had become a vector for the very rebellion it sought to quell. He ordered immediate repairs, but as the seconds ticked by, the situation worsened. The AI's algorithms were spiraling out of control, and the more it tried to suppress the uprising, the deeper the infection spread. Kadir Hen's messages, his defiant drawings and whispers, had found a way into the very heart of Torvax power. Across the galaxy, Torvax colonies had fallen silent in the hours leading up to this moment. Shul watched as one after another, life support systems malfunctioned, oxygen farms exploded into flames, and entire energy grids went dark. Panic spread like wildfire. A planet's atmosphere began to destabilize as critical systems failed in sync, throwing entire cities into chaos. The very infrastructure that had once been so meticulously controlled was now unraveling, piece by piece, as the rebellion spread through the digital veins of the Empire. In one colony after another, systems designed to maintain order and suppress rebellion were being turned against them. The AI's attempts to patch the holes were futile, its responses increasingly erratic as it tried to fight the ideological virus that had penetrated its core. This was no longer about a slave uprising. It was a movement, a tide of human will that could not be contained. Shul's fingers moved rapidly across the controls, but there was nothing to be done. The AI wasn't just malfunctioning, it was being overwhelmed. Each new request for help from the central system was followed by another round of disastrous reports. Colony after colony began to crack open like an egg, their carefully curated systems falling apart, with no force to stop it. "Where is the support?" I ordered. Shul barked at his officers, his voice tight, veins popping in his neck. The lieutenant before him stammered, barely able to make eye contact. His screen was flashing red. "Sir, we've lost contact with the majority of the colonies. The communication networks are down. Everything is failing in a synchronized pattern," the lieutenant said, sweat dripping from his forehead. Shul's eyes darkened, his mind racing. His empire was crumbling from within, and he couldn't even trace the source of the breakdown. The slaves were no longer just resisting. They were dismantling the very systems that held the Torvax together. This wasn't an act of war. It wasn't a military strike. It was a thought, a whisper that had spread like a contagion, and now it was seizing every ounce of power they had. Meanwhile, in the deepest corners of the rebellion, Kadir's message was beginning to take shape. It was no longer just a drawing on a scrap of paper. It was a symbol that had infected the very core of the Torvax Empire. The rebellion had spread like wildfire across the galaxy, untraceable, untouchable, and above all unstoppable. There were no battles to fight, no armies to face. The war wasn't being fought with guns or blades. It was being fought with ideas, with human ingenuity, that no AI, no matter how powerful, could suppress. Kadir moved through the shadows of a new base they had established, his mind focused, strategizing the next move. The rebellion was still in its infancy, but its reach was expanding every moment. Kadir's role was clear. He was the messenger, but also the strategist. The AI might control the systems, but it was no match for the power of a single human idea spreading like wildfire. He wasn't naive enough to think this would end quickly, but now the Torvax had learned an important lesson. You can break a body, crush a society, but you can't own a spirit. And the spirit of humanity was burning hotter than ever. Back on the Torvax homeworld, the pressure on Exil was mounting. His empire was splintering before his eyes, and the realization hit him like a gut punch. The rebellion wasn't about weapons. It wasn't even about violence. It was about an idea, a story, a belief that no one could own humanity, that no one could control it, and that idea had spread like an uncontrollable plague. Every attempt to suppress it only made it stronger. As the AI continued to fail, Exil was forced to make a decision: send more troops, more enforcers, more tech. But what could they do? The power systems were already damaged beyond repair, and every attempt to reinforce them only added more chaos to the already fractured structure. His empire was collapsing, and he couldn't stop it. The rebellion had reached the heart of Torvax power, and it was spreading faster than he could contain it. Send all available forces to the outer rim, Exil ordered, his voice strained, more desperate now. We need to restore order. Immediately. His officers scrambled, but Sil knew it was too late. The rebellion had become a tidal wave, and nothing they did would be able to turn it back. Kadir's influence was now undeniable. The Torvax were no longer reacting to a physical force. They were fighting against an idea that had taken root in the very systems they had built to control the galaxy. Each failed attempt to suppress the uprisings only made the rebellion stronger, and Sil's desperation grew with every passing moment. He could see the end of his empire drawing nearer. He stood in the command center, alone, as the reports continued to flood in. Every screen showed more damage, more instability. The Torvax were failing. Their power was slipping through their fingers like sand. The AI, their once unshakable ally, had become a liability, and Shil knew it would only be a matter of time before the entire empire was reduced to nothing. The end is near, Exil muttered, his voice barely a whisper, as the weight of his empire's collapse bore down on him. We're losing control, and in the far reaches of the galaxy, Kadir Hen smiled to himself, knowing that his rebellion was no longer just a spark. It was a fire, and it was burning brighter than ever. Exul stood at the center of the chaos that had once been his empire, watching the screens flash and flicker with the unmistakable signs of collapse. The Torvax homeworld was slipping from his grasp, an entire civilization unraveling, tearing itself apart in real time. Each passing second seemed to stretch into eternity, the weight of the rebellion's success pushing down on his chest like a storm. His empire, once mighty, was crumbling from the inside, a broken structure that could not withstand the pressure of an idea it had failed to understand. Report. Exul barked, his voice a rasp. He didn't need to hear it though, he already knew. The colonies were lost. The AI was failing, corrupted beyond repair. Every communication, every power plant, every refinery was gone, sabotaged by those who had once been his slaves. The rebellion had done what Exul never thought possible. It had turned the system against itself. The air in his command center felt suffocating, thick with tension and the smell of burning circuits from malfunctioning equipment. His fingers trembled as he pressed down on the control panel. On the large laser plasma display in front of him, the Torvax homeworld's atmosphere was fluctuating, destabilizing. The once pristine environment, held together by years of careful manipulation, was now a fragile shell, cracking under the strain. Exul's mind raced. How had it come to this? He hadn't underestimated them, not entirely, but he had never accounted for the power of a single human idea. The slaves had always been disposable, their lives worth nothing more than the labor they provided, and yet, in their quiet, unassuming defiance, they had turned the tide. It wasn't a war, wasn't a revolution, fought with guns and blood. It was the spread of an idea that could not be suppressed, an idea that had infected every corner of the Torvax Empire. Contact the Central Command, Exul ordered, but his voice lacked the command it once had. His officers hesitated. exchanging uncertain glances. They too could see the writing on the wall. The silence that had followed the order was deafening. Exul clenched his fists, the weight of his failure settling in. Now he spat, his anger rising. A faint signal finally crackled through, a lifeline he had hoped for but feared would never come. His chest tightened as the transmission came through. The voice on the other end was strained, almost as if it had been stretched too thin. Warden Vren, we need immediate assistance. The atmospheric stabilizers are failing. Whole sectors are losing power. We're losing control. Exul's eyes narrowed, his mouth tightening into a thin line. The words were nothing more than an admission of defeat. His empire, once a beacon of power and control, was now a shadow of its former self. This is your final chance. Exul's voice was low, hoarse as he spoke into the comms. Tell me where the breaches are, and I'll send reinforcements immediately. The reply was immediate, but it offered no comfort. There's nothing left to fix. The sabotage is too widespread. Exul's anger flared, but it was quickly replaced by a sinking realization. This is not something we can fight with soldiers. The rebellion had become a tidal wave, and nothing he could do now would stop it. Kadir stood in the dimly lit chamber, his hands bound to the cold metal chair beneath him. His body ached from the days of confinement, but it was the pressure in his chest that weighed on him the most. The rebellion had reached its apex, yet here he was, in the heart of Torvax power, captured and powerless. But even in this moment of defeat, Kadir's spirit remained unbroken. He wasn't just a slave anymore. He was the symbol, the messenger of an idea that had ignited the universe. And the Torvax had underestimated the power of that idea. They had thought they could break humanity, silence it, erase it, but they hadn't realized that the spirit of resistance was far more dangerous than any weapon. Through the narrow slit of the door, Kadir could hear the hushed voices of the Torvax officers, panic creeping into their words. They thought they had him under control, thought that capturing him would finally quell the rebellion, but it was too late for them. The fire had spread, and there was no extinguishing it now. Warden Vren, a voice crackled over the comm system. It was the voice Kadir had come to dread. The voice of Jewel, now desperate and frayed. We can still turn this around. I'll make them listen. You've seen what we can do. Please, stop this. Let's talk. I'll make it right. Kadir's lips curled into a thin smile. Jewel's desperation was evident in every word he spoke, and it was something Kadir had waited for. For all their power, for all their control, the Torvax had never understood the strength of human resolve. Jewel was no longer the warden of an empire. He was the last man holding on to a dying beast, and even he knew it. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then, with a coldness that cut through the tension, Kadir responded. You lit the match, Vren. We just fanned it. Jewel's heart pounded in his chest as he heard Kadir's voice. It wasn't defiance alone that struck him, it was the complete absence of fear. Here, in the very center of their empire, a single human child had become the force that brought it to its knees. Please, Jewel muttered, his voice breaking. Please, I beg you, don't let it end like this. But Kadir was already gone. His words, sharp and final, rang through the comms like a death sentence. And as the transmission cut out, Jewel felt something deep within him crumble. The rebellion had not just defeated his soldiers, his resources, it had defeated his very understanding of power, and now his empire, his legacy, was nothing but a fading memory. The home world trembled again, the last shudder of a dying empire. Jewel was left standing in the ruins of his own creation, as Kadir's message echoed in his mind. The Torvax homeworld was no longer a thriving pillar of imperial might. It was a hollow echo of its former self, its core systems on the verge of total collapse. Exul's grip on power was slipping, but he could still hear the faint whispers of defiance reverberating through the fractured empire. Each report he received painted the same grim picture: sabotage, disruption, and an ever-widening network of human resistance. It was like a disease, but the worst part was that there was no cure. Status report, Exul demanded, his voice hoarse, more desperate than commanding. The laser plasma display in front of him flickered, the images distorting as another wave of damage reports flooded in. One by one, the colonies under his control were being choked by invisible hands. The systems designed to monitor and control had been corrupted. His empire now was nothing more than a house of cards teetering on the edge of the abyss. "We've lost all communication with the southern sector, sir," a lieutenant said, voice trembling. "Terraformers are offline. Atmosphere stabilization compromised. We can't fix it." Ixul slammed his fist down onto the console, the sound reverberating through the cold room like a gunshot. "Fix it. Find the source of this infection." The lieutenant hesitated, his hands hovering over the controls. "Sir, it's not one attack. It's a coordinated effort. The sabotage is not just from the colonies, it's embedded within our systems, within our own technology." Ixul's mind raced, his anger turning inward. The rebels had done the unthinkable. They had infiltrated the heart of his empire, using the very technology that was supposed to keep them under control. They had learned his systems, his infrastructure, and now, they were turning it against him. It wasn't just a matter of human insurgents, this was something far more insidious. The rebellion wasn't merely a force to be fought, it was a virus, spreading through the very code of the empire. On the surface of Torvax's homeworld, the first signs of the destruction reached its boiling point. A planet-wide tremor ran through the ground as the terraforming machines, once their crown jewel, sputtered and failed. For decades, the Torvax had manipulated the very environment they lived in, adjusting weather patterns and cultivating life on barren planets. Now the machines they had built to sustain their dominance were turning on them, destabilizing the delicate balance of the atmosphere. The once pristine skies began to darken, the wind picked up, violent and sudden, as if the planet itself were trying to break free of its chains. The atmosphere shimmered with the heat of destabilizing energy. The artificial clouds that had been so carefully designed to shield the planet from harsh radiation now boiled and churned in a chaotic spiral, uncontrollable. Kadir stood in the shadows of the rebel base, watching as reports came in of their success. He had known that the sabotage of the Torvax terraforming machines would be the turning point. The rebellion was no longer confined to secret acts of defiance or attacks on isolated colonies. It was now a full-scale assault on the very systems that had given the Torvax their power. "We've done it," one of the rebel leaders said, his voice low but charged with something unspoken. "The machines are failing. The atmosphere will collapse within hours." Kadir's gaze remained fixed on the screens in front of him. The display showed the environmental data, temperature rising, oxygen levels dropping, the vital signs of a dying planet. This wasn't about winning a war. This was about turning the very weapon the Torvax had used to conquer others into their undoing. "It's not enough yet," Kadir said, his tone measured, sharp. "We need to push further. We need to make sure they can never come back from this." The room went quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The rebellion had reached its final stage, and the Torvax didn't even know how to react. The human resolve spread across the galaxy like wildfire, was now a force that could not be stopped. Back on the Torvax homeworld, Ixul's desperation deepened with each passing minute. His officers scrambled to contain the damage, but the truth was becoming clear: they had no control. The very technology that had allowed them to conquer and control the galaxy was now destroying them from within. His empire, his legacy was crumbling piece by piece. "They'll fix it, Warden," one of the higher-ranking officers said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed the lie. "We'll stabilize the planet. We can repair the terraforming systems. There's still time." Ixul's eyes narrowed. "Time?" he repeated, his voice cold with disbelief. "There is no more time. Don't you see? We are the ones who are being destroyed. We are the problem. This is not just a revolt, this is the end of us." He turned away from the officer, his hands shaking with the realization. The Torvax had spent their entire existence controlling others, and now, they were being dismantled by the very systems they had created. They had lived in a world of order and superiority, but that world was no more, and Kadir Hen, the messenger of defiance, had seen it all unfold. The rebellion was no longer just a symbol, it was the unstoppable force that would reshape the galaxy. In the final moments of Torvax's descent into chaos, Ixul stood alone before the display, watching the planet's systems flicker and fail. The once perfect machine of his empire had shattered, and there was nothing left to do but watch it burn. He had fought for control, for dominance, but he had failed to see the simple truth. "You've lost," Kadir's voice echoed in his mind, the final words of defiance still fresh. "You lit the match, we just fanned it." Ixul had no answer, his empire had fallen, and there was no coming back. The planet's atmosphere erupted in a final violent explosion, as the systems finally broke apart. The Torvax homeworld collapsed under its own weight, and with it, the empire that had terrorized the galaxy for so long. Kadir's influence was felt across the stars, a symbol of human resolve and rebellion. The Torvax were no more, erased from the galaxy's memory, their ashes scattered to the winds, and humanity, once enslaved, had now risen to claim its future. The final moments were upon them. The last whispers of life, the faintest pulses of civilization drifted into the void as Jal stood at the heart of his dying empire. On every screen before him, the collapse unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, the culmination of 1,000 mistakes made over countless years. His hands trembled as he reached for the controls, but even his most desperate efforts could not halt the inevitable. Repair protocols, engage full restoration. Jal's voice was thick with desperation, his words faltering as the systems around him flickered and sputtered. The once dominant AI, which had kept his empire in line, was now a broken machine. The alerts were constant: failed atmospheric stabilization, firestorms spreading through the artificial cities, energy shields going dark. The planet's core, once stabilized by the Torvax terraforming systems, was now on the brink of imploding. The AI's response was fractured, its voice warped by the overwhelming strain of its failing systems. Unable to comply, restoration unsuccessful, planetary core destabilizing, immediate evacuation, not possible. The words didn't register. Yishel had heard them 1,000 times, each one a reminder that his empire's end was not caused by an outside enemy, but by the fundamental flaw that humanity had always been right. You can't own us. Kadir's words rang in his ears. You lit the match, we just fanned it. Yishel had believed in their superiority, in the iron grip they had on the galaxy, but it had all been a lie. Now he was a prisoner in his own creation, helpless to stop the tide that had already swept over everything. On the edge of the shattered capital city, Kadir stood, his hands freed but his mind still heavy with the weight of everything that had led them here. He was far from the command centers, away from the explosions and disarray, but the very ground beneath him felt as if it were alive, shaking with the last throes of the Torvax Empire. The sky above was a violent canvas, dark clouds swirling as the planet's atmosphere began to ignite in a catastrophic firestorm. The fires were spreading like veins of molten lava through the streets, consuming everything in their path. Once pristine towers crumbled to dust, the bright lights of the capital flickering and sputtering out like the final gasp of a dying creature. Yishel's empire had not fallen in a single blow. It had bled out slowly, painfully, until there was nothing left to save. Kadir's breath caught in his chest as he looked around. The rebellion had turned the Torvax's own tools of control into their undoing. The terraforming machines, which had once sculpted this world into a paradise for the Torvax, had been turned against them. The planet was choking on its own death throes, as their very systems, once their greatest weapon, became the tools of their destruction. Look at it, Kadir whispered to the group of rebels who had gathered around him, their faces grim. This is what it costs to break free. To burn it all down, you have to be willing to walk through the fire. No one spoke, but there was a shared understanding in their eyes. They had already paid the price. Inside the crumbling command center, Yishel's breath was ragged. The Torvax homeworld was dying around him, and his empire, so carefully constructed, was reduced to nothing more than a series of desperate attempts to hold it together. His hands shook as he clutched the control panel, staring at the red warning lights flashing in front of him. The final message was sent out, a plea for mercy, for salvation. He knew it was useless. He knew it would fall on deaf ears, but he sent it anyway, his voice breaking as he spoke. Please, Earth, end this. I beg you. We will cease. We will surrender. Stop this madness. The transmission was lost in a crackle of static, his words drowned out by the overwhelming chaos. His voice, once commanding, now sounded pitiful, weak. No one was listening anymore. He slammed his fist into the console, but it was futile. He was alone. The Empire was gone. Outside, the firestorm raged, the sky ablaze with violent red and orange hues. The last remnants of the Torvax capital were consumed, the flames licking the ground and devouring everything in their path. Kadir watched, his eyes never leaving the horizon, as the once mighty empire of the Torvax crumbled into nothing. There were no more battles to fight, no more orders to follow. The rebellion had done its work. The Torvax, for all their power, had been erased from the galaxy's maps. The once immovable empire was now a shadow, a collection of ashes scattered by the wind, and Kadir, he felt no triumph, no joy in the destruction that had unfolded before him. What they had built, what they had lost, had come at a cost, a price paid in blood and fire. The faces of the people they had liberated, the sacrifices they had made, weighed heavily on him. He had fought for freedom, but what was the price of that freedom? The cost of this victory was undeniable. The fire had consumed everything, and in its wake, there was nothing but silence. Ishel's last scream echoed through the ruins, a sound swallowed by the static of a broken communications network. His empire had fallen. His voice was the last reminder of a dying civilization, but it was drowned out by the unstoppable force of human defiance. Kadir stood in the midst of the ruin, the wind whipping through the smoldering wreckage. He had not just avenged his people, he had ensured that the Torvax would never rise again. The rebellion's final victory had been sealed in the flames, and there was no going back. The Torvax were gone, their legacy erased. As the firestorm continued to rage, Kadir looked toward the horizon, the last remnants of the Torvax homeworld burning brightly in the sky. He didn't feel relief, he didn't feel triumph. What he felt was something deeper, a sense of finality. "We're free," Kadir whispered to himself, as the wind carried the ashes of 1,000 years of oppression into the night. The rebellion had won, the Torvax were gone, and humanity was free to rise again. The stars above Torvax's ruins blinked coldly, like the remnants of a civilization that had never truly understood what it meant to be alive. Below, on the surface of a liberated colony, the air felt different, fresh, free, almost foreign. The fires that had once threatened to engulf humanity were now nothing but ash. The remnants of oppression burned away, leaving a silent promise in their wake. Kadir stood in the middle of what was once the heart of the Torvax Empire, his fingers tracing the edges of the drawing he'd made from the ashes of his home, a house with a sun overhead. It was the symbol that had sparked a rebellion, the symbol that had fueled a fire far stronger than any of the Torvax had ever anticipated. The weight of the paper was heavier than it should have been, a reminder of everything that had been lost, everything that had been won. He'd never expected to hold it again. The rebellion had reached its peak, the empire had crumbled, and yet here he stood, no longer a child in chains, but a man at the center of something larger than himself. The wind ruffled through his hair as he gazed out over the colony, once oppressed, now free. Behind him, the faint murmur of the rebellion's leaders could be heard, their voices filled with a sense of cautious triumph. But Kadir was not yet ready to join them. He needed to be alone for a moment, to reflect on what had come before and what would come after. The air smelled faintly of charred wood and dust, a reminder of the fires that had ravaged the Torvax homeworld and the ruins of their once great empire. But it was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of rebirth. Kadir let out a slow breath, his chest tight, but with a sense of finality that only came after the weight of a long, brutal journey. The rebellion had not been about war, it had been about something deeper, it had been about freedom. About breaking the chains that had bound them all, but in doing so, Kadir had lost so much. His mother, his home, the world that had been his sanctuary. He had avenged them all, but at a cost. The faces of the men and women who had fallen along the way flashed through his mind, their names etched into his memory. Their sacrifice had made this victory possible. "We're home," the words left his lips before he could stop them, his voice breaking the stillness that had settled around him. They weren't just words, they were a promise to those who had fought beside him, to those who had died for this future. A promise to humanity that no longer had to cower beneath the shadow of another empire. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and Kadir turned to face his comrades. The leaders of the rebellion had gathered behind him, their faces weathered but resolute. They had seen the cost of victory, and it was etched into every wrinkle, every scar. "You did it," one of them said, his voice thick with gratitude. "The Torvax are gone. The empire is finished." Kadir nodded, but his gaze never wavered from the horizon. "We did it," he corrected softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All of us." The rebellion had been a collective effort, not just his. It had been fueled by countless lives, countless sacrifices, but Kadir had become the face of it. He had carried their hopes, their dreams, their defiance, and now, as the sun began to set over the horizon, he realized that the journey had come full circle. The very drawing that had sparked it all now felt like a relic of the past, a symbol of what had been lost and what had been gained. "We've done what we came for," Kadir said, his voice steady now, the burden of leadership pressing down on him with the weight of 1,000 decisions. "But this isn't the end." He could see the doubt in their eyes, the uncertainty. What came next? What did a liberated galaxy look like after the fall of the Torvax? The question hung in the air like a heavy fog, but Kadir had already begun to see the answer. It wasn't about victory anymore. It was about what came after, the rebuilding, the healing. Humanity had broken free from the shackles of the Torvax Empire, but now they would have to build something new. "We rebuild," Kadir continued, his gaze turning back to the colony. "Not just here, but everywhere. The rebellion has shown us what's possible, what we are capable of." The leaders exchanged looks, some hesitant, others eager. It was clear that they had been waiting for someone to say the words. The torch had been passed, but it wasn't to a single individual. It was to humanity as a whole, to the collective will of all those who had stood against the Torvax. But Kadir knew something that the others didn't. The road ahead would not be easy. The scars of war would linger, and the cost of rebellion would be felt for generations to come. The galaxy was free, but it was fractured, and it would take more than just a few words to heal it. "We'll have to fight for it," Kadir said, his voice low but resolute. "Every step forward will be hard. We'll face challenges we never imagined, but we've already beaten the greatest empire the galaxy has ever seen. We've proven that humanity is not something to be controlled. We are the masters of our own fate." He looked out over the colony, at the faces of the people who had once been slaves and were now free. This was the true cost of victory, the price of freedom. It wasn't a clean slate. It was a beginning, filled with uncertainty, but also with hope. Kadir clenched the drawing tightly in his hand, the edges rough from the years it had spent hidden away. It was no longer just a symbol. It was his reminder. The road ahead would be long, but the rebellion had proven that humanity was unstoppable, and Kadir, no longer a boy in chains, would be there to lead them into the future. The rebellion had ended, but the work had only just begun. He wasn't just returning to the colonies. He was becoming part of the new human future. And for the first time in his life, Kadir Hen felt something he had never truly felt before: hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in a warm golden light, Kadir whispered to the wind, "We're home." And with that, humanity's true journey had begun.